Well, hello and good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar session. My name is Ian Fegley and I'm the Director of Outreach and Engagement here at the Forum for Youth Investment. The Forum is a national nonprofit, nonpartisan action tank that combines thought leadership on youth development, youth policy, cross-sector partnerships, and developmental youth practice with on-the-ground training, technical assistance, and supports. Every year, the Forum convenes the Ready by 21 national meeting, which brings together more than 500 national, state, and local leaders who, like you, are committed to improving partnerships, policies, and practices for children and youth. We are very excited to announce that the 2018 Ready by 21 national meeting will be held in Palm Beach County, Florida on April 18th to 20th. Every year, there are dozens of stimulating workshops and sessions from top leaders in education, policymaking, advocacy, and out-of-school time. To share the expertise of these leaders and inform the field of youth development, we've launched this free webinar series featuring the best content from the last Ready by 21 national meeting. Today's session is focused on social belonging for youth success, and we'll cover the research on social belonging, including a glimpse at the neuroscience of belonging and how it has been linked to positive outcomes among youth in diverse settings. Presenters will discuss how youth program staff, educators, counselors, and mentors can practice simple exercises to promote belonging in their settings. Our presenters today are Shannon Davidson and Karen Pittman. Shannon is a senior researcher based at Education Northwest in Portland, Oregon. Shannon works on a variety of research and technical assistance projects in the Pacific Northwest region and beyond, and her areas of focus include post-secondary readiness, youth development, and evaluation. Karen is president and CEO of the Forum. She's a respected sociologist and leader in youth development. Prior to co-founding the Forum in Irby, Karen launched adolescent pregnancy prevention initiatives at the Children's Defense Fund, started the Center for Youth Development and Policy Research, and served as Senior Vice President at the International Youth Foundation. A few logistical notes for today's session. It is being recorded. It will be sent to all of you as soon as it is posted. All lines are muted throughout today's call to avoid any background noise. So please submit your questions either using the chat feature or the Q&A features that are located at the upper bar of your screen. So it's now my pleasure to turn it over to Shannon.
Thank you, Ian, and thanks to Karen for presenting with me today, and of course, thanks to everyone for joining us. I know that many of you have tuned in today because you're familiar with the Forum for Youth Investment and the Ready by 21 initiative, and Karen is going to speak some more shortly about how the topic of belonging fits in with the wonderful work that they do. So to tell you a little bit more about Education Northwest, we're an independent nonprofit research and technical assistance provider, and we're based in Portland, Oregon. We work with schools, districts, and communities across the country in areas like school improvement, family and community engagement, college and career readiness, and equity. And in 2015, Education Northwest merged with the Institute for Youth Success, which was formerly known as Oregon Mentors, so that together we can support best practices at youth-serving organizations. As Ian introduced, our objectives today are to get familiar with some of the research background on social belonging and discuss how it relates to the work that you do in youth development. And then we'll introduce a few practical strategies that you can try out in your own setting if you work with youth. So along the way, I do hope that you'll make use of the chat window to send along questions and comments as they come up. And if we don't have a chance to respond right away, we'll have some time at the end of the presentation to circle back and try to get to any questions that we may have missed. So let's start at the beginning. What is belonging? There are many ways that we can describe what belonging means. As you can see from this word cloud, the common theme is human connection, connection between people. So for our purposes today, we'll use this definition of belonging, which is feeling like an accepted, valued, and legitimate group member. And it's important to stress the feeling like part of that definition. And keep in mind that when we talk about belonging, we're referring to people's subjective perceptions about their acceptance in groups. And that may not always seem to match reality. You might know a young person who seems very connected, is a part of a lot of clubs or organizations, seems to have a lot of friends, but that young person may still feel a strong lack of belonging. That person, her responses and her behaviors. So that's what we need to pay attention to. We can think of belonging as kind of a psychological hub. It's part of a complex system of interworking social and emotional factors. And it's important for both academic success and general well-being because it's difficult, if not impossible, to be fully engaged, motivated, interested, and persist in a context where you don't feel as though you belong. So when we're concerned with whether we belong or not, that uses up precious mental energy that could be directed to other things, and we just have fewer resources left over. So because it's kind of a hub that allows all these other pieces to work, we believe it's one of the first things that educators and youth workers should attend to. Belonging matters so much because as humans, we're inherently social creatures. We have a strong need to form and maintain positive connections with other people. And some psychologists theorize that this evolves out of our need for connection to groups, which was so critical to our survival in our early history. So in other words, we're hardwired for connecting with other people. And in fact, research has shown that we are very attuned, consciously or not, to even very, very subtle cues about our belonging status at all times. So you may have experienced something like a friend giving you the silent treatment, which would be a very overt kind of rejection, but we actually can pick up very subtle cues in our environment, like eye contact. You know, you can tell from across a room if somebody is making eye contact with you or not. And as further evidence that the need to belong is hardwired, some neuroscience research shows that similar regions of the brain are activated when you experience physical pain as when you experience social pain. So think of the metaphors that we use to describe rejection: broken heart, hurt feelings. They indicate a common sort of alarm system in the body that is activated. And actually, one interesting study recently found that taking Tylenol can actually help when you have hurt feelings following a rejection. So to underscore again that belonging is a fundamental need, although people may differ in the quantity of connections that they want, we all want to be connected in some way. And to distinguish between a need and a want, failure to satisfy a want may lead to some disappointment, but failure to satisfy a need can lead to severe distress and negative long-term consequences. So you can think of it as the difference between a treat and a nourishing meal. And it seems to be that the need for social connections is universal, that the results from the research that we'll talk about have been replicated again and again across different cultures, across time. So keep that in mind today if you don't see your exact population of young people represented in the research that we discussed. There's good reason to believe that a lot of the findings are generalizable and can be applied to other groups. If you work with young people, or any people for that matter, you may have seen evidence of some of the psychological consequences of exclusion. These can include sadness, anger, a harder time regulating our emotions and behavior, and even impaired cognitive functioning. But some of the physical consequences might surprise you. Research suggests that loneliness actually poses some of the same health risks as smoking, drinking, and obesity when it comes to predicting mortality. Belonging matters across the lifespan, but there are some particularly key moments that are relevant to our discussion today. Adolescents' sense of belonging, as you probably have experienced, may be particularly vulnerable because young people are increasingly becoming independent from their parents. They're negotiating new peer groups and relationships. And another moment of vulnerability is times of transition. So we tend to be particularly fragile to threats to our belonging when we move to a new place or start a new school or join a new program. These are times when new social ties must be formed and uncertainty about whether or not we belong is introduced. And these are the times when we find ourselves asking, do I belong here? Belonging may be particularly important for young people who identify with any type of underrepresented or marginalized group. In schools, clubs, and other settings, youth from underrepresented groups might be more likely to question their belonging simply because they have less evidence that people who look like them or have the same backgrounds belong there. So it makes sense if you look around and you don't see others who look like you or that you identify with, you may be more likely to question your belonging. And then at that point, the question, do I belong here, actually becomes a more global question of, do people like me belong here? Is my group welcome here? Am I safe here? And that's what makes belonging so important for equity. And Karen is going to talk about this in greater detail in a minute. But when we talk about equity in education, we rarely talk about gaps in belonging. We more commonly use language that focuses on the structural inequality, discrimination, achievement gaps, opportunity gaps. And we clearly need to do all that we can to address those structural disparities and in society at large. But that's, given how hard that is to do directly and to do today, focusing solely on those factors, that our progress would be slow and that little would be done in time to help the youth that are working in our schools and community programs today. So we can think of addressing a young person's sense of belonging as a kind of in the meantime strategy. An additional consequence of structural inequalities is the fact that youth from historically underrepresented groups are often denied a sense of belonging in academic, professional, and other important settings. So with this in mind, we believe belonging is a really important place to focus our attention to get at those drivers of outcome disparities in ways that are immediately actionable in our settings. So of course, we need to always be working towards attacking structural inequalities. But in the meantime, attending to young people's sense of belonging can be a fruitful approach, and it's easier for educators and youth program workers to work upon directly and to work upon today. Let's take just a minute to talk about the difference between, or the intersection rather, of belonging and identity. If you take an example of maybe being part of a dragon boat team, belonging refers to someone's perceived fit within a certain group or domain, and identity relates to the importance placed on being a member of that group or domain. So maybe you feel like you fit in on the dragon boat team, and that has to do with your sense of belonging, and the extent to which being a member of that team really shapes who you see yourself as a person, that has to do with identity. So they're related, and also very context specific. So a person can have a distinct sense of belonging within school, within a particular class, within a group of friends. A person can also experience a sense of belonging in larger social categories, such as gender, race and ethnicity, or sexuality. Belonging is also multidimensional, and what I mean by that is that a young person might feel like an outsider in a certain domain, such as an after-school activity or a club, but still feel connected to her peers in that domain, or vice versa. A young person might love school or a particular activity, but have trouble connecting with his peers in that space. So both aspects of belonging are interrelated and important. We're going to talk next about what it actually feels like and what happens in the brain when you question your belonging, sort of the signs and symptoms of belonging. But first, I would love to hear from you. You'll see some questions up here on the screen. So using the chat window, would you share some examples from your own experiences? First, think about a time when you experienced a sense of belonging in a group. How did you know that you belonged? So we're going to take a minute and see what comes in the chat window. Okay, we're getting some great examples. Some people say they know they belong when others talk to you, when you have shared references, when people reach out to you individually to check in, when you feel that people are glad to see you and they want your input and value. They allow you to open up, they know your name. These are all great examples. And can you think of a time when you didn't experience belonging? What did you notice in those moments? How did you know that you didn't belong, the other side of the coin? Feelings of isolation, feelings of rejection. A lot of the comments that are coming in share this theme of feeling like an outsider, feeling left out, or perhaps judged or ignored. Some specific actions people are mentioning are being talked over or interrupted, nervous and left out, neglected, not wanting to be with that group. Okay, thank you for sharing those examples. And the reason I wanted to hear from you and get us to think about our own experiences is that it's really important to be in touch with your own personal experience with belonging before you can really affect change in others. So thank you for that. So let's take a look at what happens when you question your belonging. And you'll see, I think, some of your own suggestions reflected in the following slides. So if you're in a situation and you ask yourself the question, do I belong here? If the answer is, I'm not sure, you tend to become more vigilant. You pick up more on the cues that are coming in from your environment. And you simply pay attention to things in different ways than you would if you were feeling confident or secure in your belonging. And this can sort of trigger a cycle where you not only notice things more, like a peer who doesn't say hi to you, a teacher canceling a meeting, maybe if you're in a game and the ref calls a foul on you, you not only notice these things more, but you actually tend to assume the worst about them, interpret them in the most negative light possible. So, for instance, if a person doesn't say hi, you might end up sort of globalizing that into, well, everyone here must hate me. This must mean that I don't belong. And this, of course, creates even more uncertainty about belonging, which feeds back into that cycle. On the other point, if you do feel very secure and confident in your belonging, if you ask yourself if you belong and the answer is yes, then you are less vigilant. You simply notice things less. And you're more likely to give things the benefit of the doubt. If someone doesn't say hi, you think, oh, well, the hallway was busy, or he or she just didn't see me. And that, again, feeds back into bolstering belonging, promoting resiliency. So just to use this example one more time, if a peer doesn't say hi in passing, if you're coming from a place of vigilance where you aren't sure if you belong versus coming from a place of having the benefit of the doubt, it creates different perceptions of the same environment and really importantly leads to different responses and behaviors. So the person who is lacking belonging might globalize and conclude that nobody here likes me, and that's going to affect the response and the behavior. And that person may be less likely to put effort into forming relationships in the future. Whereas the person who does have a secure sense of belonging may take the consequence of the person not seeing them and turn that into a positive action of, okay, maybe I should be more direct next time. So our responses then sort of perpetuate the cycle and determine the next actions that we take. So at this point, I'm very pleased to hand the virtual microphone over to Karen Pittman, who's going to talk about how belonging fits in with the Ready by 21 initiative and youth development work more broadly.
Great, and thank you so much, Shannon. I obviously was there the first time when you presented this and know your work well, but it's always exciting just to hear you go through these slides. On the one hand, they seem basic, but on the other hand, they're so fundamental. I just have one slide that's up, and I'll talk about it in a minute, but I want to just reflect on a phrase, a turn of phrase, literally a turn of phrase that I've been using for the past couple of months, which I think speaks to why it's so important for us to have a conversation about the importance of belonging and to particularly have these conversations in the context of a growing focus on building young people's social and emotional skills and making sure that that skill development is integrated into academics. And it's the flip that happens when you take the phrase social and emotional learning and you flip it to say learning is social and emotional. And that really, for me, sort of sums up the several comments that you've made in the research that you've shared about just how much energy is taken away when you come into an environment and you don't feel, and it is about perceptions, you don't feel emotionally safe, or you don't feel sort of socially accepted or socially relevant. It does physically reduce the amount of energy you have to concentrate, to focus, and to learn. And it also, as you said, emphasizes the likelihood that those social and emotional skills that are sort of at at the basic end are those reactive skills, your emotion management, your ability to sort of regulate, self-regulate, and even your ability to be empathetic for others, to others. Those really get limited when you don't feel socially and emotionally safe. So one of the things that I think it's really important for us to emphasize as we're toggling back and forth between conversations about what we can do to integrate social and emotional learning into the environment, and in particular into schools, which is a big push. And I'm a member of this National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development through the Aspen Institute. And the focus there is really on how we get social and emotional learning integrated into academic development, not just isolated in explicit classes, but really integrated into math classes and other things. And so I think it's really important as we're trying to get this idea of paying attention to building social and emotional skills, and that's higher order skills like problem solving and teamwork, and a sense of responsibility and creativity, those kinds of things that sort of push up the scale and have young people really ready for college, work, and life, are very important to build, and we need to make sure young people have a chance to practice those skills. But your emphasis on basically reminding us that if young people don't feel that they belong, the likelihood that they're going to get and feel safe enough to practice those other skills is there. And this really is an important topic when we start to think about equity, and how we're coming into places where we're legitimately concerned about the quality of instruction, the quality of the content instruction that's happening and getting to young people so that they're getting prepared academically, but we don't pay enough attention, as you said, to this problem that the actual environments that young people are coming into don't feel safe and supportive to them. So the slide that we have up is really a slide that we got to at the conclusion of the work that we did a couple of years ago called Readiness by Design, and we looked at research and the growing set of practices that were coming out across the fields from youth development and K-12 education, employment training, juvenile justice, child welfare, civic education, all the folks who are increasingly suggesting that young people have to build this broader set of skills. And you can go to our website and see that sort of array of the list of skills, but those are much more familiar to us, that we're talking about clustering things like self-regulation and emotion management and empathy, teamwork, responsibility. People use the word grit. You know, there's lots of words that describe those skills that we want young people to have and competencies. The thing that was more interesting is that when you began to look at the work that people were doing to say, well, what is it that we have to do to make sure we're creating opportunities for young people to build and practice these skills, it really came down to these four basic building blocks, that we have to focus more on the environment and make sure those environments are safe and supportive and culturally relevant and skills-based. We have to make sure that we actually have people in the environment, you know, who can care, who coach, who are also there to sort of equip and empower young people, and then obviously who can skillfully plan and execute so that young people are actually getting high quality learning experiences that really challenge them and push them to grow in ways that are relevant, and also are creating the opportunities for young people to experience those things in the kind of space and time that allows them chances to reflect, to share, to challenge, to take risks. So there, across these settings, there really was a focus on how do we actually change practices in the settings where with young people to make sure that we're creating environments, training staff and volunteers, executing high quality experiences, and then really giving young people the space and time to sort of settle in and learn in natural ways. But it really did start with creating these safe and supportive environments. So I just wanted to emphasize how important looking across not just education and youth work, but looking across all the settings where young people end up spending their time, how much of an emphasis is coming back on creating learning environments and making sure that adults are paying more attention not just to the content of what's being taught, whether it's employment training or it's helping young people put on a play or play basketball or learn remedial English, but also the context of that learning environment, and that starts with that very basic sense of making sure that adults are really sensitive, as you said, and you're going to go into a minute to the strategies to promote this, but are really sensitive, in particular to young people who are coming into learning environments and may feel different. They may ask that question, do I belong here? I'm not sure. And to make sure that we've got practitioners who are more attuned to that and more attuned to then making adjustments in the environment, sort of, co-creating environments in which the maximum number of young people feel safe. So this list of what we call the readiness practices here is a list that in some ways we're suggesting no matter what your official practice is, what you're officially charged to be working on, whether it's pregnancy prevention or teaching kids algebra or doing summer learning programs, we've got to make sure that these developmental practices are in place so that young people really have an opportunity to come in and settle in and feel that they belong. Once they feel they belong, they're more likely to participate. And once they're more likely to really engage, they're going to be more likely to learn. So let me stop there, and we can have a little bit of an exchange back and forth. We can also take questions. If anything that I've just said, putting this in the larger context, has prompted people asking questions. So Shannon, does that resonate with what you're thinking and learning out there in Oregon on the other side of the country?
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to share a couple of examples of some kind of specific and concrete things that you can do. But as you point out, the best way to make this happen is to make it a priority in training and to put developmental practices into place, integrate it into all parts of the programming. So keep our focus on the importance of what we do as adults in settings to create these safe environments. One participant did ask if you could repeat the turn of phrase as you stated it, that you've been thinking about.
Yeah, it is really sort of pausing to listen to the difference of what comes to mind when I say social and emotional learning, SEL. We talk a lot about SEL, social emotional learning. And the difference of what comes to mind when you use that phrase versus the phrase learning is social and emotional. And for me, making sure that we're using both of those phrases reduces the temptation that when we say social emotional learning, we sort of move our way quickly towards thinking that's what we have to teach kids. We have to teach them social and emotional skills. And what you're emphasizing is that the first thing that we have to do is actually create learning environments in which they feel socially safe and socially engaged and emotionally safe. So it's the flip between talking about social emotional learning, which may imply that the way we bring that into classes is to make sure we have time to teach that as content, versus learning as social emotional, which reminds us of the importance of the learning context.
Great, thank you. And I appreciate that turn of phrase as well, because there are so many terms floating around that a lot of participants may have heard of: non-academic skills, social and emotional learning, non-cognitive skills, and they're all each problematic in their own way, even though a lot of it is interrelated. But the settling on a term like learning or skills is difficult because some of this is more like a capacity or something that comes from the environment. It's not necessarily a skill that can be taught. And it's certainly not always the responsibility of an individual young person to have or have not this skill. It's really up to us as adults to create safe environments and to promote belonging in our work.
Right. And one last thing, just as you flagged, what we really have learned, and we can put some research pieces up after the webinar to share this, is even when young people have some of these skills, if they don't feel that they belong, they're not going to use them. So there really is a hierarchy to these skills, and feeling that you are, feeling that you belong, feeling that you're safe, and accepted and that you belong here allows that first sort of fight or flight response to calm down enough so that you actually can engage and demonstrate what skills you have in terms of being able to participate and take responsibility for assignments, and that then challenges you to move on to other kinds of skills that demonstrate your problem solving and your leadership skills. So we know that these things build, and we do know, as you said, that environments can be very particular, and a young person's behavior and ability to sort of take on problem solving and leadership roles in one environment doesn't necessarily translate into the other one. Depends on how they see themselves in that environment.
Great. Well, I think this is a great segue into talking about strategies. A participant has asked for some resources about how to implement practices among teams. So at the end of the presentation, and certainly as a follow-up, there are a lot of resources available. We can try to point you towards them. So let's go on now to talk about just a few examples of strategies to promote belonging. And again, this is what we've been talking about, how adults are responsible for creating environments that promote belonging, and it really needs to be an intentional part of every youth program, and not necessarily a standalone segment of programming, but actually integrated into a lot of the learning activities that we do in education and youth work. And of course, I know I'm preaching to the choir in many ways, that when I talk about our responsibility to do all we can to create environments that foster a sense of safety and belonging. So two of the routes that educators and youth workers can go down to intervene have to do with either changing the environment to promote relationships and foster belonging, or to go sort of a more psychological route of actually helping youth perceive more belonging. And I want to point out that there is, it takes research-based some time to catch up with what practitioners already know. And there's a lot of practitioner evidence that suggests how critical it is to work on the environment. A lot of the research evidence in terms of what you might find in a peer-reviewed journal comes from the second route of exercises and activities that can work on how a young person perceives his or her sense of belonging. So both of these there are a lot of different strategies and things that you can do in both of these areas to promote belonging. So we're just going to go through a couple of examples, starting with the more environmental approach. And this may reflect a lot of the work that you already do. Emphasizing similarities between yourself and the youth that you work with, practicing inclusivity, participation, always demonstrating mutual respect, and creating ways to learn about each other's interests, hopes and dreams, the good things that are going on in your life. Taking the time to discover an interest you share in common, even if it's something as simple as supporting the same baseball team, can be very impactful to creating a connection. Some educators and youth workers use formal processes to uncover these common interests. There are some surveys called similarity surveys that you can find that may facilitate some of this exchange if it's hard to get it to happen naturally. But you can also seek out ways to incorporate this type of informal work into your daily activities of learning about each other. Another general strategy is to take a look at the actual physical objects in your space. Objects serve as cues about who belongs in a particular environment and can really powerfully signal the culture of the people associated with that environment. So if you look around and don't feel any physical space, it may end up sending a signal that perhaps you don't belong there. So this has actually been shown to be really important for promoting belonging in STEM. Several studies that relate to female students' sense of belonging in STEM have found that adding things like natural elements like plants or nature posters to a computer science classroom can be really impactful, and girls may be more likely to feel that they belong in a non-stereotypical classroom as opposed to a computer science classroom that has just computers in rows of desks, because it's a sort of an implicit message that calls to mind that stereotype of computer science as a male realm. So changing it up, changing the image might help to shake some of those stereotypes off. And little things, even as simple as a potted plant, don't underestimate the power of little things that can shape your physical environment. Turning now to some of the research-based strategies that can help youth perceive more belonging. This is an example, again, this has shown to be really powerful in STEM. And this is the idea of using struggle stories to demonstrate that even the most famous and accomplished people have struggled in their own lives and struggled along their own journeys. When young people are struggling in a particular subject or domain, they may perceive that struggle as an indication that they're not good at it, they never will be, they'll never succeed at it. And research has found that exposing young people to stories about how famous people struggled in their own development can actually foster a sense of belonging. So in this example, understanding the ways that Einstein struggled in his journey to become a scientist makes it seem like it's okay to go through a process that's similar. And it doesn't mean that you're never going to succeed. So these stories can powerfully impact people's attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. So one experimental study that tested this had students read stories about how famous struggled either professionally or personally, and both story conditions improved their science learning post-intervention relative to students who were in a control condition that didn't read the struggle stories. And importantly, the effect of that intervention was more pronounced for low-performing students. So it really can be powerful for closing gaps. And not only did learning and achievement improve after the intervention, but the students in the struggle story condition felt connected to the stories and felt connected personally to the about. So here's an example of what something like that might look like. These are two different stories about Marie Curie, and you'll see one of them has more to do with her professional struggles developing as a scientist, and the other has to do with her personal struggles having to study in secret because people were not supportive of her going to school. And reading these little examples of how people got to where they are and overcame difficulties can have a powerful impact. Another strategy to introduce has to do with normalizing belonging uncertainty. And this exercise gives young people the opportunity to share with each other the message that it's normal to worry about belonging in a new setting, that with time these concerns have the potential to fade. And so importantly, it's not about minimizing or dismissing anyone's concerns about belonging, but rather normalizing and showing that it's safe and okay to go through your own process. So the message is, I've been there too, it gets better. This can be done in a lot of different ways. It can be done with letters, videos, in person, whatever might make sense in your setting. In this example, this is an example of using letters to convey that message. So youth might read an example letter written by a slightly older near peer, or maybe someone who has been participating in a particular program that conveys the message, it's typical to worry about belonging. Over time, this will fade. So a sample letter might look like this. If you're like me, when I started, I had some worries. It was hard to find my way around. And after a while, I figured out that other people were feeling the same way. We all felt different and like we didn't fit in. I guess we're more alike than we thought. And this is sort of a simplified version. It's important, of course, to make this authentic and to have it actually be written by near peers or conveyed in a video message, or even in person, getting together and hearing about each other's processes. And then the second part arguably is the most important, because it gives the people who received the message a chance to then turn around and pay it forward by doing their own letter to someone who's coming next, or creating a video for the next person. And this really helps because it makes the young person feel less like he or she is kind of being intervened upon, but rather is actually given a chance to be a beneficiary, a benefactor rather than a beneficiary. And in general, when it comes to interventions, the less it feels like an intervention, the more powerful it's going to be. So finding a way to work these naturally into programming is really important. So at this point, I'd love to open this up for discussion. This is just a couple of strategies that we've shared along with some of the research base that we've talked about. And I'd really love to hear from you. How do you think these strategies intersect with work you're already doing? Or do you feel you would need to adapt them to make them effective? Or we can come back to any other questions that you might have for myself or for Karen about belonging. So we'll open this up to the chat window and take your questions as they come in.
Yeah, the only question that I see since you answered the last two was somebody asked about the type of survey. Was that called a similarity survey?
Yes, I believe Panorama Education has a version of this called a similarity survey, and there may be some other versions available. And it's, you know, simple things. What's your favorite color? What kind of sports do you like to, you know, what do you like to do in your community? What do you like to do with your friends? Things that a classroom or a group of students might take. And it gives the teacher a chance to learn about students. And interestingly, a study that was done with similarity surveys showed that really who got the most benefit from it was the teacher. The teacher felt connected to the students in a new way after learning some of the things that he or she had in common with them.
Yeah, that's great, Shannon. I think one of the things that we might want to talk about, especially since it comes back to relate in a broad way to the question of equity and how belonging fits in, is to spend a little time to tease out, you know, when you ask your question of sort of normalizing belonging in uncertainty, sometimes that uncertainty really does come from identity. It comes from the fact that I actually have been successful, have made my way through high school, have gotten a college scholarship, and now I'm among a very small minority of students who are either from my racial or ethnic group, or from my income group, or as you mentioned in the STEM class, even from my gender. So what's the value of actually encouraging and having opportunities for young people to spend time in their like group so that they can actually talk about that uncertainty that they feel coming into a space in which most people are doing? Then how do we make sure that they don't get so trapped in that like group that they don't come back out and experience or have the opportunity to experience belonging in a more diverse group?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as you were talking, I was thinking about the activity of normalizing belonging, uncertainty, and the importance really of making sure, I know I mentioned it before, but the authenticity piece is so important. And you have to be really careful when saying something like, I've been there too, because in most cases, if not all, you haven't. Everyone is unique, and everyone's struggle is unique. And so it's not going to ring true if you try to say that you've been through the same thing. So it's not necessarily about saying that your struggle is the same. It's not at all. It's more about that everybody has their own unique struggle with belonging. And the thing in common is that everybody has some sort of unique struggle with belonging. It's not that the struggle is the same, and it's not to dismiss the individuality of somebody's struggle. It's just to say that this is a human experience, and it's okay. So I just wanted to make sure to highlight that part of it.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I think also that there's some exercises, and I've seen these done with adults routinely, not just even with kids. There's some exercises to help people understand and basically help a group see the number of ways that people may have multiple identities as they come into a room. So whether you line everybody up along a wall, you may have seen this example, and then ask people to start to step forward or step backwards depending on whether they are something visible or something not. Step forward if you're from a city versus a rural area, or step backwards if you're X. Those kinds of things so that people can see the diversity of who's in the room are simple ways of getting people to not just sort of stay with the more obvious labels. And then other examples that have been used in helping people really sort of get more sensitive around equity issues are examples like asking everybody to think of 5 ways that they would describe themselves, and people usually start with the most obvious, I'm a girl, etc., and then go down to others. And then when asked different questions, as you would come into a situation like X, which of those ways of describing yourself would you lead with? And those are some ways that to normalize belonging uncertainty. It's a way to sort of connect that back, as you said, to the idea of identity. And I think especially when we're talking about working with young people who are from different backgrounds and working with young people who may be coming from more disadvantaged backgrounds, coming out of situations of trauma, et cetera, we need to be able to go back and forth a little more nimbly between helping young people acknowledge differences in identity in order to figure out how to normalize that uncertainty that comes with belonging. So I like the idea of normalizing the belonging uncertainty, and think we can probably sort of work that into some of the more explicit ways that we're offering practitioners' approaches to working with either diverse groups of young people or groups of young people who are different from them.
Great.
Yeah, there's been just a wealth of questions that have come in since we've gone to this discussion area. I think Karen has addressed. There's been several related to equity and inequality that I think Karen's been able to address. One of the specific questions regarding the environmental cues, somebody asked, Adrian Penner asked, should the environmental cues be more of a representation of the person who controls the space, such as the youth development staff and what they want the space to represent, or should those environmental cues be more of a representation of the youth themselves? Obviously, it's a mixture of both, but whose narrative do you want to target when you're using environmental cues to help shape the ethos of the room?
Well, I think ideally, whoever you are working with would help to take an active part in creating the space. I think that creating a space together that reflects values and experiences that make a group of young people feel safe would be the ideal situation. I think the idea is just to shake up the stereotypes that might be associated with a certain type of activity, because those sort of real subtle implicit messages are what's going to make someone feel that they don't belong. So I think that it definitely, if it could be a collaborative process that involves everybody, that would probably lead to the most inclusive and welcoming space.
Okay. Another question from Brian, this one from Brian Curry. I work in the public health sector, prevention strategies. This makes me think about how gentrification and changing neighborhoods might affect youth's feelings of belonging and therefore make their neighborhood feel like a less supportive or safe or developmental space. Any thoughts on how belonging can be increased on a systems or community-wide level?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And the issue of gentrification really does come up, and sometimes we underestimate the importance of the fact that young people pick up cues in their external environments, not just in the programs. A short example of that, here in DC, probably about a decade ago, as some of these neighborhoods here were sort of gentrifying rapidly, there was a Boys and Girls Club in a traditionally pretty low-income neighborhood that as that neighborhood gentrified and they owned their building, they were able to sell their building for so much money that they actually negotiated to basically sell the building, move out for a year while the building, a high-rise was being built, and then move back in to put the club back in the same place so that young people really would not have had their club displaced. because this was still at that point a mixed income neighborhood. And what they found, to their distress, was that while they had been able to basically put a club back, that was a much more welcoming environment on the inside because they had upgraded everything. They didn't take into account the fact that the club entrance and the condo entrance were next door to each other. So you had young people who were used to basically feeling comfortable hanging out outside of their club, interacting with people who were coming in of a very different racial and income group were coming in, and it made the young people so uncomfortable that club attendance actually went down, even though the actual quality of the club, the improvement of the facility went up. So we definitely have to take that into account. And there are two things, and I think they go back to point. One is to really sort of be explicit with young people about having conversations about what it feels like not to feel that you're belonging and welcomed because gentrification is happening in your community. And another is really to take that conversation to the community. And often that, and they did some of that, and that did help. That they then met with the folks they met with the condo association and explained that these young people were not lingering. They actually were club residents and they had as much right to be there, and started to set up exercises where the young people and the adults could get to know each other to lower those tensions. But I think that's exactly the kind of thing that we need to be vigilant about.
And I think that example speaks to another question I saw coming in about moving to positive action. When you sense that belonging is impinging upon your rights and justice, that's one way to turn that into positive action.
And I'm seeing a pretty wide wealth of questions. You know, clearly people are very interested in implementing this in their programs and are looking for training or guidance or ways to kind of specific questions for the similarity activities that you mentioned, any particular tools to measure how youth are perceiving their belonging. Are there any research validated ties to resilience? So kind of that next, you know, how do people operationalize this in their programs and in their interactions with youth? That seems to be a thread through many of the questions.
Well, one of the things that we didn't put a slide up for, but certainly we can post after the fact, the Weichert Center for Youth Program Quality is a part of the Forum for Youth Investment, just as the Institute for Youth Success is a part of Education Northwest. And the Weichert Center over the past couple of decades has really perfected a set of not only assessment tools to help you assess the quality of your learning environments according to these basic categories of, do they feel safe? Do they feel supportive? Are they engaging young people? Are they providing enough opportunities for choice? But also develop trainings, both training the trainers and also just methods training for people to have a wealth of practices for everything from thinking about welcoming activities, thinking about how you create the environment. So we can put those links up as well. But that's the Weichert Center for Youth Program Quality and the Youth Program Quality Assessment tools and methods trainings are concrete examples of this. It is possible to come very practical things to observe to make sure that you are creating environments that are self and supportive. So this doesn't have to just be something that's guesswork. It really can be something that youth and adults can basically give you pretty reliable information about whether you're doing it. And then what you always have to do is to make sure that you're creating environments that are safe and supportive for the maximum number of young people who are coming in, and that the youth workers or the teachers or whatever the professionals are really sort of trained to really look at individual young people, and as Shannon has said a couple of times, make sure that you're noticing if they're feeling uncomfortable, because the thing that reinforces it, back to that example very quickly, is if you come in, don't feel that you initially belong and nobody notices and tries to correct that situation. It just makes you feel less that you belong less, and you get more unsure.
And I've just put up a slide that has a few resources, and when we prepare the these will be available obviously in the recorded presentation. And I think the Weichert YPQ tools that Karen talked about are also a great example of a resource that's out there.
Great. Well, Shannon, it's really been great having a chance to talk with you. I knew the time would go by quickly, as it did. I think we've got lots of comments and examples going on, so I will let Ian figure out what to do with all of those as we come back, and I'll hand it back to Ian for the last couple of words.
And Shannon, did you have any kind of last words or summation points?
Well, here are a couple of references in case you want to learn more about some of the research that we went over. These are some of the articles that describe those experimental studies that you might want to reference. And of course, you know, continue to do your own investigating and your own action research about this if you can, by trying things out, seeing what works for you in your own setting and sharing that learning with others. And of course, when it comes time to evaluate how well your ideas are working, researchers are available to help you. And we hope that this is just the beginning of a conversation that is going to continue to get more and more visible and important in education and youth work in general. So I really want to thank you for your interest and for joining us today.
Great. So I just have a few engagement opportunities that I'd like to mention, and would of course like heartfelt gratitude to both Karen and Shannon for presenting this session for the second time for this broader national audience. So thank you very much to both of you. You know, first of all, we definitely encourage you to sign up for the Ready by 21 Ready News newsletter to stay informed of opportunities such as this one. At the beginning, I mentioned the Ready by 21 national meeting, which will be in April in Palm Beach County. We actually have the workshop proposal process live and open right now. The deadline for submission to that is Friday, October 6th. We definitely want to hear and have as many different types of people presenting as possible from all over the country. So please visit readyby21.org/national meeting for more information about that. Next week, Karen will be speaking with Search Institute CEO Kent Peckel about relational development. And that session will be on Wednesday, September 20th from 1:30 to 2:30 p.m. We also have a number of webinars coming up similar to this one. Wednesday, October 11th, we have the intersection of after school and SEL for 21st century readiness, presented by the American Youth Policy Forum. The next one is social and emotional learning for staff and leadership, which will be focused on the Anchorage Youth Development Coalition. And lastly, we have a colleague from the Annie E. Casey Foundation who will be speaking about promoting equity for LGBTQ youth, and that session will be Wednesday, December 6th. So we have a wide number of these types of presentations coming up, and many opportunities to learn from you know, people doing great work all over the country.
And Ian, if people want to check on all those dates, if they didn't have a pen handy, where will they find them?
I will send them out to all of them and our website and newsletter.
Great. All right. Thank all of you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.